Good morning, everyone. For today's conversation, I'm joined by Terence Johnson, Associate Professor of Religion and Politics in our Department of Government and a Senior Research Fellow at our Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And Terence is also a part of our Department of African American Studies and our Department of Theology and Religious Studies. So Terence, it's wonderful to have this opportunity to be with you today. And I'd like to begin by asking you about your work, which is at the intersection of race, religion, and politics. And what can we learn by exploring these ideas together? How does engaging with religion and race shape our understanding of our national identity and our political framework?
Well, first, I just really want to thank you, President, for the invitation. I'm really honored to have this conversation, to share my work with this incredible community. Um, you know, I really came into religion and politics in part based on my upbringing in a very small, sort of rural Black Baptist church in Indiana. And I was always sort of curious as to why we were talking about the Exodus narrative within our church and what that meant in terms of both as a story, but also as something that was tied to a place called Israel. And I think as I developed and grew in terms of my own intellectual work, the idea of returning to religion and race, right, in terms of the whole birth of America is quite interesting because as we think about, say, the city on a hill, this idea that America is this place where Puritans saw it as a New Jerusalem. I really wanted to see, well, what about the people who are at the very bottom of the hill? How do we then imagine, take account for Native Americans, for African Americans? And that sort of story always seemed to be sort of bracketed. Like we talked about Still on the Hill, then we talk about, say, Native Americans and talked about, say, African Americans, but never as a sort of holistic story. So part of my work is trying to do is sort of bring together the ways in which religion and politics have overlapped as we've tried to develop this wonderful constitutional democracy, and to show how it both sort of hindered progress, but also then sparked sort of new ideas.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Now, you've recently completed a new book, We Testify with Our Lives, How Religion Transformed Radical Thought from Black Power to Black Lives Matter. And it will come out this coming summer. Could you share with us a bit about this project?
Yes, sir. So it's really, I wanted to sort of go back and look at the Black Power movement and really try to explore the ways in which Carmichael's utterance of Black Power spoke to a different kind of tradition that's often ignored. Often when we think of Black Power, we think of Black Power as sort of anti-white or Black Power as a kind of inward turn toward nationalism. And what I discovered by going through the archives of the Library of Congress is that people use Black Power as a way, in part, to push against sort of the rhetoric of anti-Blackness. And I saw sort of that trope of Black Power in some ways as an effort to sort of reclaim a kind of sacred notion of Blackness. And then in order to disrupt it, because once he makes that argument around Black Power, then SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and other sort of leftist Black organizations began to think about how do we engage sort of third world politics, how do we engage what's happening in Africa, and then link what's happening to America to sort of the broader kind of global public. And it's interesting is that they got this idea from Malcolm X, but also from a number of Black women, like Ethel Minor, a woman who's rarely known in history books, but who's very key in pushing Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael to think about racial politics, not simply within the confines of America, but to think about it as sort of a global problem. And then how would that then shift the conversation if we're thinking about race globally and not simply within the white, Black US binary? So I wanted to bring together how that sort of call for Black power linked back to religion, Black religion as a kind of counter public tradition, counter public sphere, but then also show how that then developed into a project around human rights activism in the US.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. Now, another area of focus for you is the relationship between the Black and Jewish communities. And you've worked closely with colleagues in our Center for Jewish Civilization. And you and Professor Jacques Berlinerblaum, our Rabbi Harold White Chair in Jewish Civilization, have worked on a new book together, Blacks and Jews, An Introduction to a Dialogue, which will be coming out with Georgetown University Press. Can you share with us some of the key ideas that you explore by studying and teaching this complex history?
Sure. You know, when we look at Blacks and Jews in America, we really see a kind of central issue that we often ignore when we talk about politics, right? It's really sort of this long history of the ways in which Christianity and how bad uses of Christianity have played into both creating anti-Blackness, but also into creating anti-Semitism. And so we wanted to sort of explore how might, looking at the history of Blacks and Jews, what might it tell us about American democracy in terms of how people come together around racial solidarity, how they come together around sort of public issues, and how they use sort of their differences to sort of expand sort of the liberal project. And what's interesting is that we really try to debunk the myth that Blacks and Jews are somehow naturally allies. And we really try to show that in part, this relationship is very sort of complicated. We have relationships between elite African Americans and elite Jews who help, say, establish NAACP and the National Urban League. And these are people who are involved in legal rights, working with the Legal Defense Fund, NAACP. Then we also have sort of a different dynamic around many African Americans who are in urban communities, who are working class, who are interacting with American Jews, who are, say, merchants, right? And that creates a very different kind of relationship. And also Black women who are domestic workers and men in Jewish homes. So that's another kind of very complicated relationship. So we try to explore that, right? By looking at sort of literature, we look at music and look through, film to show how these people, how these groups have actually both had a number of disagreements, but then have found areas of interest, right, to coalesce around. And we think that if we explore Blacks and Jews and some of the conflicts, we might be able to sort of tease out ways to think about how to deliberate and how to think about justice in a more robust way.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, this semester, you're teaching two courses, each thinking in different ways about ideas of justice and democracy and inequality. What are some of the ideas that you're exploring with your students?
Sure. So in my undergraduate course, I'm teaching a course called Racial Liberalism, Law, and Justice. And this is sort of a new project where I'm trying to look at the ways in which we use the Constitution, right, as a kind of sacred text. And I asked, of course, my students, well, what would happen if we sort of pushed against how lay people read the text? Often people say, well, if it's in the Constitution, then this guarantees my right to do X or Y. And I bring in an African-American biblical scholar named Vincent Wimbush to describe something called scripturalization. And I want to argue that often as lay people, we read the Constitution as another form of scripture. And often with scripture, we use it to affirm what we hold very deeply. And then we root ourselves in that commitment. But I want to argue, well, what if we actually read the Constitution as a kind of talking book? Where we're in dialogue with it, where we're using the best resources to think through current situations. And so that's sort of the overarching kind of theoretical theme. And then I want to show how the ways in which we have defined anti-Blackness and whiteness, right, have been not static, but something that we have sort of developed. So we look at early cases around citizenship, around the ways in which the transference of wealth from African Americans to the descendants. And there's one particular couple of early cases in the early 1800s, Bryan versus Walt in 1864, where there's a woman who is phenotypically white, but her accountant knows that she's actually passing. And when she dies, there's a question around whether or not, what do we do with her inheritance? And in fact, the judge decided, well, because she hadn't performed a certain civic duties, voting, right? She wasn't involved in civic life, therefore she can't pass on her inheritance. And what's interesting is a scholar named Ariel LaGrosse argues that, well, this is the idea of performing whiteness. And often in our legal system, we look at the ways in which whiteness is performed and then link that to the ways in which we, expend rights to people. And so I use some of these things in terms of performing whiteness, right? Thinking through how do we think about segregation, and the ways in which religion is kind of at the very core of the ways in which we read this text very strictly. How might then bringing in the talking book sort of challenge the ways in which we are imagining the possibilities of the Constitution, but also the very limits of how we then execute these ideas?
Well, that's fantastic. Do you have a second course in addition?
I do. So I have a graduate course on cosmopolitanism and democracy. And here it's just really trying to think through with my course ideas around what does it mean to be sort of cosmopolitan? What does it mean to think about global citizenship? And on what terms do we define it? And that's been really quite fascinating because part of what at the core of what's driving this is, and this is also a new course, but what's driving this course is that, I argued in one essay that I think part of the issue with President Barack Obama had everything to do in part with race, but also this idea that I want to argue that he was slightly pushing the nation toward a kind of very thin cosmopolitanism, right? When we look at sort of his speeches, say in Cairo, when he's in Germany, sort of the response he's getting worldwide, there's a way in which I think he's trying to push us, right, to a broader vision of who we are. And part of why I think sort of he gets a lot of pushback from many African American academics, but also from the progressive left, is that he didn't deal specifically with sort of the racial issues as we imagined. But I think the whole idea that Obama was pushing, right, was this idea: how do we think in a kind of global way about not only about our problems, but in terms of pushing our limits? And I think even with the title of his new book, A Promised Land, it's very interesting, right? Like, what do you imagine? Is this promised land something that's just isolated to the US, or is it far more global? And again, I'm still trying to research this project, but I think it's a far more global vision than we actually imagine. And that becomes rather frightening for many of us. This idea: what does it mean to think about our borders, right, as being much more sort of flexible than they actually are? I mean, what does it mean to really think of our country as a nation of immigrants in a very robust way? And so these are some of the questions we're dealing with in a cosmopolitanism course.
That's great. That's great. Now, earlier this semester, you were part of a series of conversations focused on racial justice in the university, hosted by the college. And you were joined by Gwen Michael of our Department of Anthropology and Scott Taylor of our African Studies program in the School of Foreign Service. Can you reflect on why interdisciplinary conversations such as this are so important? And how can we foster the engagement of our community in the work for racial justice?
No, I thought that was an extraordinary program and a great idea by the, dean of the college, in his office. Um, Part of what I think came out of that discussion was this whole idea that we have to see racial justice as really critical to how we imagine intellectual development, right? Intellectual strategies. And it can't be something that we bracket, right? The very idea that we're here to pursue knowledge, I think, means that knowledge is addressing what are the current problems. And for far too long, we have bracketed racial justice as something that, say, a few people study, something we isolate in a department. And I think that conversation forced us to see how this is a broader issue, and that it's woven into our disciplines and how we see the world. And part of what we are, I think, compelled to do as intellectuals, but as scholars, right, is to sort of push the very boundaries of what knowledge is. And part of that is really for reflecting upon the ways in which, these issues are overlapping, right? That when one deals with, say, issues of gentrification, we have to deal with, right, economics. We have to also deal with this idea of the moral problem of Blackness, or this idea of the Negro problem, as Du Bois called it. What does it mean to have a problem people in your neighborhood? Do you want someone who has, say, access to your neighborhood, who's poor, right? Who has some kind of, So anyway, so it just seems really interesting to bring together, right, different fields, just to push us in terms of how we're thinking about the world.
Got it. Got it. Well, I can't thank you enough for taking this time for this conversation. As we close, is there a message you'd like to share with our community?
Sure. I've been really struggling, over the past couple of months in terms of what's happening, in terms of the police killings, the unrest around the election. And I've been trying to figure out, well, how do I respond, and what do I tell my own family? And I was reading Howard Thurman, who is African American male theologian and considered a mystic, and he taught this whole idea that even in the midst of darkness is when one can actually see a great deal of light. And part of what I've been trying to just tell my family, but also implicitly tell my students, is the idea that this is a moment of great potential, right? Despite sort of the frustration, despite the agony we're feeling, sort of, that we're all locked in, that this is the moment of deep potential. And even though it's so easy to fall prey to just a kind of nihilism, I'm really, hoping and praying not only for myself, but for the community, that we're able to kind of pull out of this in a way that makes us stronger, but also clearer about the very issues that we have to tackle. And so I think this is a moment of great potential, even though this great potential comes with a lot of pain and a lot of literal death.
Thank you. Thank you. And again, thanks for taking the time for this conversation and for sharing your insights with us. And I look forward to being with all of you again soon. Take care of yourselves and take care of everyone around you. For every Hoya, everywhere.